Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. It's almost Halloween, so today we're going to talk about a fixture of that holiday, witches. In fact, we're going to look at an episode from the Bible that prominently features a witch. Now, we're not talking about a witch with a pointy hat and a bubbly cauldron. We're not talking about a witch who floats and turns people into newts. In fact, we'll see that our idea of a witch probably isn't even the most accurate description of what this person did. In today's video, we're going to look at the story of the Witch of Endor. In 1 Samuel 28, we find a bizarre incident where Saul consults a spirit medium, the so-called Witch of Endor. This story takes place just before the end of Saul's life and his reign as king of Israel. Saul had disobeyed God, and God decided to take the kingship of Israel away from Saul's family. Samuel had anointed David as the next king, and after David's victory over the Philistine Goliath, David's popularity soared. This provoked Saul's jealousy, and David fled to live among the Philistines. The story begins with the death of Samuel, who had remained a trusted advisor and prophet of God for Saul even after the end of Saul's kingship was assured. Without Samuel's guidance, Saul felt lost. 1 Samuel 28:3 notes that Saul had expelled all the spirit mediums from the land. Finally, the Philistine army had gathered against Israel. We'll pick up the story in verse 5. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." "There is one in Endor," they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." And the king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth." "What does he look like?" he asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." After this, Saul falls to the ground and faints. The spirit medium feeds him and sends him on his way. When the Philistine army and the Israelites do battle a few chapters later, Saul loses the battle and several of his sons are killed. Subsequently, Saul takes his own life, and the warning of the spirit of Samuel comes true.
This story seems bizarre to us today, but would have been more comprehensible in the ancient Israelite world. The story is about the practice of what is called divination. In our time, we tend to make a sharp distinction between the sacred and the natural world, but that was not the case in the ancient world. Ancient peoples widely believed that the supernatural world blended into our own, and what we usually call the natural world. Now, it follows then, if the boundary between these worlds was permeable or even non-existent, the natural phenomena could have supernatural significance. And if we could read the signs in the natural world, you could divine what was causing that natural phenomena in the supernatural world. Some divination was done by people like prophets. It was their job to be intermediaries between the divine world and our world and communicate a message from the divine world to ours. Interpreting dreams also falls into this category. Dreams were often understood to be sent from gods, and interpreting them would reveal a message from the gods. Other divination was done through interpreting natural phenomena. Patterns, sequences, and combinations of seemingly natural events could be understood as divine communication by those who were trained to interpret them. One scholar has likened this kind of divination to written language. In writing, there are symbols, which are letters, which combine to make words, and words combine to form sentences that communicate meaning. The gods could write in a similar way, by using the natural world. And just as you need to know the language a text is written in, you needed to learn what the language of the gods was as they communicated. This scholar summarizes it as, all divine action causes material reaction. There are a lot of different kinds of divination in this category. You could ask the gods a question, sacrifice an animal, and expect the answer to be written in the entrails of the animal. You could ask the gods a question and cast lots, and the lot that presented itself had the answer from the gods. You could also observe bird flight patterns, celestial patterns, oil patterns on water, draw arrows from a quiver, and dozens of other things. The gods could communicate in all kinds of ways. The Bible attests to a lot of these practices in both the narrative histories and in the prophets, though not all of these practices were permissible. In a future video, we will look at some of these other divination practices. What Saul does with the Witch of Endor falls under a third category of divination, necromancy, or consulting the spirits of the dead. The witch in this story could more accurately be called a necromancer, someone who is able to call up and communicate with the spirits of the dead person. The belief behind this practice is that because the spirits of the dead exist beyond the limitations of the natural world, they may have insight into present or future events in this world or to the workings of the gods, and they could provide this information to those who know how to inquire of them. Saul comes to this woman to seek divine help, or at least the help of someone who could provide divine guidance, the prophet Samuel. The Bible says that God no longer answers Saul, either through prophets, Urim, or dreams, that is, through the generally more direct and legitimate forms of divination. So Saul turns to a practice that was forbidden by God and had just been banished by Saul himself in hopes of finding the guidance he was seeking. So what kind of divination is going on here? There's actually quite a bit of relevant background material that is illuminating here. A lot of research on this passage highlights the phrase, a woman who is a medium, which in Hebrew is this. There's a lot of ink that's been spilled parsing this phrase out, and I won't bore you with it all here. A lot of the focus is on the final word, Olv. It's not clear what this word actually means. It's either a reference to spirits or ghosts, or to some kind of ritual pit that we know from other Near Eastern cultures. In fact, numerous other cultures have a nearly identical word used to describe part of a ritual that is nearly identical to the one in 1 Samuel 28. Those cultures used very different languages from Hebrew, but they used a very similar word to the one we see in this passage for this ritual. It is possible, though again the matter is of much debate, that this is a reference to a kind of ritual pit. If that's the case, then Saul is seeking a woman who possesses an Olv, or a ritual pit. 1 Samuel 28 doesn't provide any specific details about how this ritual was conducted, either because it was well known to the original readers, or because it was so forbidden that the writers didn't want the readers to know how it was done. However, from Hittite and other Near Eastern texts, we can see how this ritual pit was used. The Hittite texts in particular describe how to commune with the chthonic gods of the Hittite pantheon, that is, the gods who are from the ground or underworld. These pits were used to help give access to these spirits from the world below to our world above them, almost like a door that the spirits could use. There are several texts which describe a ritual that, while it varies from text to text, follows the same general formula which you'll see here on the screen. Now, I know these texts are a bit odd and it may take a minute to understand what's going on, so feel free to pause the video and read them. You can also finish watching the video and then come back and read them if you like. So to use one of these pits, the practitioner first had to have a favorable spot. You couldn't just dig anywhere and expect it to work. Sometimes this was near a deceased person's grave, but it depended on the spirit as to where and how many pits must be dug. Once a good spot was found, the pit usually had to be dug in a particular way with a particular tool. In the Hittite text, it was dug with a hoe or a dagger. According to the Hittite text, the practitioner would then go to the pit at night. Since these spirits are from beneath the earth, where it is dark, they were more likely to arise into familiar darkness. This is exactly what Saul does. In the text, it seems like he goes at night to avoid detection since he has banished the necromancers from Israel, yet finds himself consulting one. He disguises himself to keep from being noticed and to avoid the obvious hypocrisy. However, it's just as likely he had to go at night for the whole summoning to work. Now, as part of this ritual, offerings of food were put in the pit or on the edge of the pit, so as to entice the spirits to come up out of the pit. The prescribed offerings vary from text to text, but common offerings include wine, breads, butter, and cheeses. One interesting trend is the frequent use of honey. One scholar has noted this may be behind the taboo on mixing honey with sacrifices to God we see in Leviticus 2:11. Now, in addition to food, a blood offering was required. This seems to be what really motivated the chthonic spirits. To sweeten the deal, gifts were often placed in the pit. These were almost always made of silver. Now, all of these offerings are meant to entice the spirits up out of the earth and into our world. The texts differ as far as what happens when the spirits arose. Some indicate the ghost looked like the person did in life. Other times it's likened to that of a specter with a more ethereal appearance. Isaiah describes it with the words similar to bird sounds or mumbling out of the dust. In 1 Samuel 28, it seems only Saul can hear the ghost of Samuel, while only the necromancer can see him. This is in line with the textual traditions of the ancient Near East. So after one had consulted the desired spirit, the hole needed to be sealed up. This could be done with something as simple as a piece of cloth, but the hole needed to be closed so that the spirits come back into our world unwanted. While the details vary, this kind of ritual was known throughout the ancient Near Eastern world. While some of these details are absent in the account of the Witch of Endor and Saul, there are enough clues from the context that we can identify what kind of activities were going on, and we can even fill in a few gaps.
Understanding the details behind this bizarre episode can give us a lot of insight into what was happening when Saul went to consult the Witch of Endor. Now, while this practice is completely foreign to us, it was common and well known in the ancient Near East. Ancient Near Eastern peoples, and even the Israelites of the Old Testament, envisioned the world and understood the afterlife very differently than we do today, even for those of us who are Christians. So, we need to understand the original context in order for this story to make sense. The prohibition of necromancy in the Old Testament indicates that it was a common practice in the ancient world, and even that it was assumed to be effective. If it had no efficacy, there would be no need to prohibit it. Now, of course, we don't have to accept the efficacy of these practices today, and there's no reason for us to believe in them or practice them. But we should understand that this was a very real part of the world of the Old Testament. But there's a larger question here. What is the significance of this story, both in the narrative arcs of Saul and David, and for us today? Now, to answer that first part, we have to contrast the relationships that Saul and David each had with God. David was chosen by God and anointed as king long before Saul's reign came to an end. David was able to consult directly with God for guidance, including through divination by using a garment called an ephod. And we can talk more about the ephod in a future video. So, if you want to see that, let us know in the comments below. Saul, on the other hand, had been rejected by God, and with the death of Samuel, he lost his only line of divine guidance. Other kings, including the opposing Philistine king, had prophets who could communicate a word to them from the gods. Saul had nothing, so he desperately turned to illegitimate means in hopes of hearing a message from God. The message he received, however, only confirmed the inevitable, the end of his life and his rule over Israel. Old Testament scholar David Sumura summarizes that through this seance, Saul only learns that his rejection has come to a head. Thus, the story depicts the futility of conjuring the dead, since this results in an announcement of death. To speak with the dead is to join the dead. But what are we to make of the fact that Saul not only consults this necromancer, but that it actually seems to work? Does that lend any legitimacy to this ancient practice? Well, not necessarily. Again, Samura notes that this story does not support the view that God sometimes uses even pagan religious practices for his own purpose. Rather, something very unusual, even from the perspective of the female necromancer, occurred through God's power. The situation, rather than the practice of necromancy, was used for God's purpose to declare his judgment on Saul. God did not work through this practice or respond to it, but utilized the opportunity to give Saul the messenger and the message he sought, even though it wasn't what he wanted to hear. Finally, what are we to make of this passage for our own relationship with God today? Now, for this application, I think we can set aside the bizarre events of the episode itself and focus on how Saul got there in the first place. Saul's downfall started with his failure to listen to and obey God. It was for this reason that the kingship of Israel was taken from him and given to David, who was a man after God's own heart. The tragedy of Saul's story is that he had to live knowing his fate, fighting to change it for years before it came to pass. The story of Saul consulting the Witch of Endor demonstrates his final desperation to hear from God and reverse his fate. Having heard nothing from God through legitimate means, having lost his connection to God through Samuel, Saul turns to forbidden means in a last-ditch effort to save himself and his kingship. The message he hears, however, is only a confirmation of what God has already spoken, and Saul has failed to accept all along. The tragic end of Saul should lead us to interrogate our own relationship with God. Are we eager to hear from God and obey, or do we only seek God when we want confirmation of our own desires? Are we seeking to conform our lives to the word and will of God, or are we hoping to bend God's will to fit our own? Are we willing to go beyond the scope of legitimate ways of knowing God in order to hear what we want to hear, rather than accept what God is already saying to us? The life of Saul warns us that there is no substitute for knowing God personally. And if we fail to seek God for God's own sake, we may not like what we hear when God finally speaks in a way we can't deny. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and check out our website, beneaththebible.com. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.